Thank you very much, Meta. And I'm honored to be with you. And many of you I know have been involved in the struggle for peace for a long, long time. I'm going to be joined tonight with a colleague from Penn, Canada, Ilamaran Nagarasa from Sri Lanka. So I'm going to speak for a while, and then I'd like to introduce him as, I think, an even more honored guest, as a refugee who is a not-so-silent witness about war. So we're going to do this together. It just struck me at one point that it's much better to speak with refugees about war instead of about them. So we're going to do this together. We've worked on a number of projects together, and especially at Penn Canada. So when Meta invited me to speak, and I reflected on what I might say, I thought I would speak quite personally about how my involvement in the peace movement and my involvement with refugees came together in a very important way in the 1990s. I was, before that, involved in several peace actions in the 1980s, as I think many people in this room were. It was a very intense time in terms of the nuclear weapons race, and I was out there with many of you and protesting and involved and worried and trying to do what I could. I found over a period of years that one of our biggest problems was not the government, but the peace movement itself, that often we were in a situation of working with people who just wanted to get arrested or make a statement. And the lack of discipline and the lack of focus in the peace movement in the 80s, I think, was so unfortunate and undercut some of our best intentions. So I do remember here in Toronto that we were quite focused on the fact that the cruise missile system was being produced by Lytton Industries up near the airport. And then there was the terrible day when Lytton Industries was bombed. Nobody knew who did it, but it immediately discredited everybody in the peace movement. And I got together at that time with some other peace activists, and we really reflected on the situation and the discrediting of the peace movement. And so we decided to make a new effort, a group that we called Christian Initiative for Peace. And we had, oh, this is mine, thanks. We had all been part of various peace groups which spent a great deal of time talking about criteria of membership, mission, focus, strategy, and so on. And we felt that we had got bogged down in all of that. And so in, I think, one of the finest one of the best decisions I ever made in my life was we said, okay, we're going to have a peace group, and there will be only one requirement for membership. And that is that you come to the weekly meeting, and the weekly meeting was at 6 a.m. And in one fell swoop, it immediately eliminated a lot of people. But it meant that whoever was committed enough to be at that meeting at 6 a.m., you knew you could count on them. And actually, with a relatively small number of people, we were able to do some significant things. Now, at that time, in the 80s, I was working as a journalist. I really didn't encounter that many real refugees, although I do remember writing stories about refugees from Chile and Argentina and using it as a way of understanding what was going on in those countries. But I didn't really know refugees. So then, in 1990, by that time, the nuclear weapons crisis was somewhat less, a little bit quieter. But the drums of war were beating again, and this time over the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. And if you remember, it was a period from the summer when the invasion happened, and then things got more and more heated. And so we resurrected this 6 a.m. group and said, we have to do something. This is, by that time, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait had asked the US and a number of other countries to get involved in protecting them. And it was heating up into another war, so we met at 6 a.m. and I think we developed what I think was the best peace action I've ever been engaged in. And it was simply this: we planned a march through the business district of Toronto, down Bay Street all the way down, and then up to Nathan Phillips Square and up University Avenue, ending in front of the American consulate. And in that march, we had 6 large oil drums, each carried by 2 large ropes held by 4 people. So as we walked down Bay Street and then up again University Avenue, we banged the oil drums as a sign. And the only sign we were carrying was, stop and think. And what we were trying to say was, this is about oil. This is what it's about. And the oil drums were there, we were drumming, and then when we got in front of the American consulate, we put the drums across University Avenue, stopped the traffic and said, stop and think, which is what we were trying to say. Now, that was in early January. Obviously, most of us were arrested in the process. And so I spent several hours in a paddy wagon with about 20 other people. And it was hot, it was uncomfortable, but it was also a wonderful time to get caught up on news and friendships and exchange ideas. And I remember particularly being with a man called Lorne Howcroft. And we had time, for the first time in a long time, just to sit and talk. And we talked about the war, but we also talked about something that was happening in my own life. And it was simply this, that in the month of December, I had gone to live in a house for refugees. Not to work with refugees, not to do anything. I had a completely ulterior motive. I was on the board of Catholic New Times. We were looking for a new editor, And the person we wanted was working in a night shelter for refugees. And she said, I'm happy to take the job at Catholic New Times, but I can't do it until I find a replacement for me as the night manager. And I said, well, how long would it take to find a replacement? She said, a month or two. And we wanted her right away. So I said, what would be involved in this? And she said, not much. You just live there and you make sure people are safe at night. And I said, easy. I'll do that. And you take the job. And I thought that was great. You know, now that was 25 years ago. But I told Lorne as we sat in the paddy wagon, in the evenings when I would have tea with these refugees, I just liked it. I just really enjoyed it. I really liked being with them. And I told him, you know, I think the people that are running this shelter are going to close it. I said, it's a shame because I think we could do something with this. We could, instead of just being social workers with refugees, we could actually just live with them and be good neighbors. And he said, what a great idea. Too bad, you know, there has to be a war around for us to sit and talk about this. So honestly, in the paddy wagon, you know, waiting outside the police station, that's really when the dream of Romero House began, in that conversation. By January 17th, the bombardment of Iraq had started. Operation Desert Storm. The Congress had already authorized the use of force. And then for 42 days, there was a relentless attack on Iraq as the coalition invaded Kuwait and Iraq. We know some of the statistics. On February 28th, there was a ceasefire, so it was a war of 42 days, we were told. 30 members of the coalition were killed. At least 10,000 members of the Iraqi army who were killed retreating along the highway of death, if you remember that. It cost at least $100 billion, the war. But nobody that I know of has yet estimated for sure how many civilian casualties there were. Now, I reminded myself of this time because I think, along with many other people, I assumed the war was over. It was over. And then we went on to start Romero House. And the first refugees who came to us a year later were refugees from the first Gulf War. And they continued to come year after year after year. Refugees from that war that was over. And still, even now, still even this year, somebody will come who's been wandering around the world ever since 1991, looking simply for a place to be and to live. And my conviction that I just share with you quite simply tonight is that wars may end on a piece of paper. They may end on a negotiating table. They may end in a newspaper, but they are never over. In the lives of refugees, they go on and on and on, with immense consequence that have never been measured. And so I think for me, I would say simply, nobody should start a war because it never really ends. It doesn't end. So I simply want to share one story, though perhaps I have about 200 or 300 that illustrate the same point of view. And this is a story of a woman from Eritrea called Hidat Mosa. And she's here with her husband, Kalab. So in 1990, Hidat and her husband Kalab were living with their 3 little children in Saudi Arabia. They were there as guest workers, doing well, earning a good living. But when the war broke out, and remember Saudi Arabia had asked the US and others to come to the assistance of the oil-producing states. When the war broke out, I'm told, the Saudis went to London. They left to the discos of London. And the guest workers were all told to go to the front, to Kuwait. And Hidat's husband was one of them. He was told, go and drive a truck down at the front. So in 1990, he was sent there, and he never came back. And that was true of thousands of guest workers. They never came back. Uncounted casualties. These were husbands, these were fathers, and once that happened, the women could no longer stay in Saudi Arabia. Without a husband or a male relative, they were forbidden to stay on their own. And so in her case, because the country she was from, Eritrea, had been liberated from the Ethiopians, but was now engaged in a new civil war. She couldn't go back there, and so she did some research and said, I will go to Canada. And there were hundreds of women who made that same choice. I know most of them. And so she sold everything. She sold their BMW, their house, her wedding ring, and bought tickets, fake passports, flew to New York City, took a bus to Buffalo, and walked over the bridge with these 3 little kids. The youngest one was called Matawi, or Desert Wind. And so she arrived. I got to know her because she was going to be deported. Her refugee claim was not accepted, and it's a horrible story. Her lawyer fell asleep during her hearing, and the judge didn't wake him up, and she was rejected, and it was a long, difficult road to ensure that she was in Canada. But she was accepted. She's a heroic, resilient woman. And she then went about trying to make a living, to raise her kids. She finished her high school. She learned English. She became a hairdresser to make a living. And she kept studying. And she went to George Brown College. And now she's a nurse. And her daughter is going to be a doctor, and so on. And then, after about 13 years, she gets a phone call from her sister-in-law. Caleb is alive. So he was in an Iraqi prison for 10 years. And then he was let out, and he wandered around until he found a way to connect with a sister in Europe, and then found out his wife and children were in Canada. And you would think that that was the end of the story. They're reunited happily ever after. Except they haven't been reunited. And although she's applied, almost 10 years ago to sponsor him, it's still grinding along. And I can go into all the reasons for that, but the bottom line is this family is separated by this war for years and years and years. And although they are doing so well, the oldest boy is so depressed. He is just, and so as much as she can, she will fly to Europe and meet her husband there and spend some time together, and that's where this picture was taken. But in the lives of this marriage, this family, these children, this war has gone on and on. Another refugee, a good friend of our community who lived with us about 10 years ago, Neighbours, was from Baghdad, from a Christian minority group in Baghdad. That's why he fled. A bit of a funny story, lest you think that all refugees are politically active and so on. This person, Neiman, although he was a member of a minority group, was not remotely interested in politics. He was studying to be an architect at the University of Baghdad. And his mistake was that he and his friends, who were in a frat house at the University of Baghdad, had a party one night, and they dressed up as women, kind of cross-dressing party. The guy got thoroughly drunk and didn't know that one of Saddam's spies was in the party. So this was his crime. And after that, his life went downhill. So he and his wife and children came to Romero House, and I do remember him saying, yes, I was in Baghdad during the bombing in 1991. And I said, what was it like? And he said, everybody had diarrhea for 3 years because the water system had been so destroyed. And he said, everybody, it was so awful. Everybody around you was leaking all the time, and the children were so thin. So in my experience over these 25 years, as I've listened to these stories, it's not that it made me more against war in some kind of way. It just made me utterly, completely convinced that we should never do this. We should never, ever do this, because the consequences are so serious. And I think it is refugees who bear witness to that. They're living. They're not among the dead. They're the living, but they're often silent witnesses to the reality of war. I've also, in listening to their stories, come to another insight that I never would have realized otherwise, and it's this, that in a war, nobody comes out clean. We can sit here at the university and talk about the good people and the bad people and good decisions and bad decisions. But I think the truth is that when a war starts, the range of moral options so narrows. There are very few just good decisions. I've just seen so many parents who had to choose between children, who to leave, who to take, friends, causes that they had to walk away from because they couldn't live. For really good people, the tragedy is that they're forced into a situation where there are few good moral options. And really good people feel compromised almost forever with that kind of reality. I think, as I've seen it, it is a remarkable spiritual achievement when I see a refugee who's experienced war, who says, the war ends here. It's going to end now. It means I will never forget it, but I am not going to let it shape the future for myself or for my children. That becomes to me an immense spiritual testament. Okay, so those are just a few of my own reflections, and I want to introduce Ilamaran Nagarasa. I met Maran through PEN Canada. He is a journalist from Sri Lanka. He was the owner of a multimedia company in Sri Lanka. It was considered the only independent source of news in Sri Lanka and was used by the BBC News Service as their major source of information. So he's a highly respected journalist and did his best to speak the truth under immensely difficult situations. But eventually, he was forced to choose between telling the truth and the risk that it would put his wife and daughter in. And so he chose to leave the country. He left with just a credit card, a camera, his journal, and flew to Thailand, where he tried to get in line to be a UN refugee and was told that might take 13 years. And so he said, I put my hope in a ship. And the ship was called the Ocean Lady. He got on the ship. He had no idea where it was going, only that it was the promise of life, and he was choosing life. And the ship landed on Vancouver Island, and I think you know the story. The ship arrived, Immediately, our government, Stephen Harper, Jason Kenney, said this was a ship of terrorists. He was placed in detention for several months. Now, the story of that voyage is remarkable, the true story. And you can ask him about it, but the true story of how these people who were so depressed that they could hardly move slowly began to help each other. And he became friends with a Christian priest. There were some orphans, workers who had worked with NGOs in Sri Lanka. It was not a ship of terrorists, but it was used to justify the radical changes in Bill C-31 put forth by this government. So Maran has spoken about that, and he is increasingly speaking. He is not silent, and he is now speaking out about the genocide in his country. And the UN report, which was just released a few days ago, which does nothing to address this situation. So I'm going to just let him take this from here, Maran.
Thank you, Mary Jo. Thank you, everyone, to giving the opportunity. And a lot of things in my heart. I am going to share some of the things through my experience, which is I have had in Sri Lanka. It has been over 5 years since a major genocide of Tamils in Sri Lanka took place, and yet even today, the innocent Tamils are still living in fear and fighting for their lives daily at the hands of the Sri Lankan government. The Tamil peoples living in Sri Lanka today are like orphans, and that fact has been proven through times and time again, and the recent 25th United Nations Human Rights National Conference, which took place in Geneva, is a great example of that. Everybody is aware that the destruction of Tamils taking place in Sri Lanka is without a doubt considered nothing but genocide. Yet under the 5-page resolution put forth by the United States government to the United Nations, there is not a single word of written about the innocent Tamils who are being killed in Sri Lanka by the Sri Lankan government on a daily basis. Despite there being thousands of evidence submitted to the United Nations showing the horrible crimes being committed against the Tamils in Sri Lanka, for the past 5 years, the UN to date hasn't been able to take any action or anything of substance to stop these heinous crimes by the Sri Lankan government. After the horrible war in Sri Lanka, the United Nations Secretary Ban Ki-moon met the devastated people in the refugee camps in Sri Lanka. All the innocent Tamils, including many women and children who are trapped there, were so heartbroken, lifeless, and upset that they did not have the willpower or words to express their sorrows and injustice which happened of them. Only tears came flowing down in all their eyes upon seeing Ban Ki-moon. All they could do was plead or pray with their hands to save them and get them out of this living hell. However, even in front of Ban Ki-moon, they were being threatened with the weapons by the Sri Lankan government's armies. That's why it was a very disappointing and disheartening to see Ban Ki-moon not being able to raise his voice or utter a single word against the Sri Lankan government, despite witnessing all of this in prison. He is a witness who could speak, and he is silent. Not only during the time of the war, but even today, the freedom of the press to speak or write about the truth is being completely denied by the Sri Lankan government. The human rights activists and journalists are either being arrested, kidnapped, being killed, silenced. The panel of experts, which was appointed by the United Nations in 2011, visited Sri Lanka, and through a lot of difficulties, with the help of thousands of witnesses, produced Darusman reports and submitted this in front of Ban Ki-moon to read and take action. And it has been over 3 years, and for some unexplainable reason, he has yet to read the report. Everyone remembers and well aware of what is known as the Black July, and then as a mother for all tragedy in 2009, the attempt to completely annihilate and destroy the Tamil race in Sri Lanka altogether. More than 100,000 of innocent Tamils were killed, including countless number of harmless children, women, and the elderly. As a simple formality, every year at the United Nations Human Rights Council resolution are being talked about the past, but in reality, no actual actions are being taken against the Sri Lankan government to stop the genocide. All this is a simple doing is allowing the Sri Lankan government to completely wipe out the rest of the Tamil race in Sri Lanka and destroy all the evidence of the killing which have and are still taking place there. At this time, the biggest question on my mind is if the Sri Lankan government and those who are directly or indirectly involved are ever going to be held accountable and punished for the genocide and all the heinous crimes they have committed against the innocent Tamils in Sri Lanka. Will they ever be brought forward in front of the international courts of justice? Or are they going to continue to look the other way and let these killings take place until our race is completely wiped out? Justice delayed is justice denied. Thank you.